Welcome everyone to a new series of videos in which we'll be covering how to draw the mannequin. If you've been drawing for a while, especially if you've been looking into how to draw the human figure, then there's a high chance you already know about the mannequin, but for those that are not familiar with it, here's a brief introduction. Throughout the last year or so on the channel, I've been covering the anatomy of the human figure, starting with the skeleton and progressing from there. At the time of recording this, I'm just about to start covering the muscles, all in the hopes of gaining a better understanding of the subject to then be able to draw the human figure from imagination. Now, in addition to these more recent videos and in the same vein, I've also covered other subjects such as drawing in perspective. Now there's a high chance you're watching this video or have watched some of my other videos because you share the same goal. In this case, you want to get better at drawing people. And so now the time has come to introduce this new series of videos alongside the more specific content surrounding anatomy and perspective. A series of videos all about this guy, the mannequin. And as usual, I'm going to try my best to progress forwards in a linear fashion, gradually introducing new techniques and building on what is covered in each previous video. Now I suppose is a good time to ask the question, why should you pay attention to this mannequin? Well, the answer is simple. If with help from these videos you can learn to convincingly draw the figure as a boxy mannequin like this in perspective and pose it in different ways, then you are only one small step away from adding the details and drawing the figure realistically. Not only will drawing out the mannequin like this allow you to pose and place figures in realistic spaces, but it will also help you plan out the proportions of the figure, which we'll look at in a moment. It's a lot more manageable to deal with these geometric forms than it is to try and attempt to draw the more organic forms that make up the human body. You might have seen some other similar versions of this mannequin that exist for the same reasons. One example being the mannequin by Andrew Loomis. This is something that I covered in an earlier study session, but again, it can be quite complex for a beginner. I've found that it's more practical to start with this boxy looking mannequin which is composed of boxes and cylinders. There's nothing too out of the ordinary at this stage, and these simple shapes are something we'll develop into something that represents the forms that make up the human figure. Now whilst there's many differences between these two, they are both drawn using the 8 head unit method of working out the proportions. Another system invented by Loomis that I have covered on the channel in the past, but for the sake of this new series, let's run over it again and see how the same applies to the boxy mannequin. Here I'll begin by drawing a vertical line that will be the height of the mannequin from head to toe. I'll draw the same line to the side of this as well, seeing as I'll be explaining this by drawing the mannequin on both a front view and a side view. Now the figure can be divided into 8 equal units, each unit being the size of the mannequin's head. Here I can divide this line into 8ths by continually halving these segments. So the mannequin is 8 head units tall, and from the front it's also 2 head units wide. So to illustrate this, here I can draw out some lines at either side at the same size, and then construct a grid like so that is comprised of equal sized squares. For the side view, I'll produce a grid that's 1 head unit wide. Now that I have my grids drawn out, let's start to draw in the mannequin. As you might have guessed, in this first section is the head. We'll look at the size of all of these forms more in depth in later videos, but for now, make this box 2/3 of a head unit wide on a front view and around 2/3 and 2/4 wide on a side view. In reality, it doesn't really matter when it comes to drawing these mannequins, but for the purpose of explaining these proportions, I like to give some kind of measurement which you can keep in mind and consider when drawing. Below the head we have the neck. This comes down to around 1/3 of the next section to meet the top line of the torso and shoulders. The torso section of the mannequin is reduced down to 2 boxes with a cylinder in the middle. The larger box at the top being the ribcage and the smaller box at the bottom being the pelvis. The cylinder connecting them would be the core of the figure. On a front view, the ribcage and pelvis is about 1 1/3 units wide. and on a side view, you can see how these boxes are tilting away from each other, seeing as this is more representative of the human figure. I previously made a video on the 3 major masses in which I had looked at this in depth, so go check that out if you are interested. On a side view, these boxes are each around 1 head unit wide. Going back to this front view, notice how the larger box for the rib cage ends around 1/4 of a head unit away from the next division, and how the smaller box for the pelvis starts 1/4 into the next section. The box for the pelvis ends around the midway point. A useful rule to remember is that the first 4 units contain the upper section of the mannequin from the head down to the pelvis, and the lower section contains the legs. The first cylinder for the upper leg comes down to the knees, which is around the halfway point of this section. For the mannequin, you might have noticed that to represent the joints on the limbs we use spheres, so 2 are drawn in for the knees. The cylinders for the lower legs come down to around the halfway point of the last section at the bottom, and these meet another set of spheres for the joint to the foot, which takes up about 1/4 of a head unit. Finally, let's add the arms. Here the shoulders are drawn in as spheres, which will meet the first cylinder for the upper arm. This comes down to around where the box for the ribcage ends and meets the spheres for the elbow joints. The lower arm is drawn in using 2 cylinders that come down to the bottom of the box for the pelvis, connecting to the hands down here. So that's the mannequin drawn in, and this diagram as a whole would be worth remembering because these are the proportions you want to consider as you draw the mannequin. Looking at this as a whole, it's easy to see that the head is 1 unit, the first box of the torso sits within the next 2 units, the box for the pelvis is the one after that, and then the legs take up the remaining 4 units, with the arms being at the side here. Now, obviously you're not always going to be drawing out grids and dividing lines up like this when you are drawing in perspective, but as a rough guide, this is useful to know. Now next to this front and side view, I'm going to draw the mannequin on a 3/4 view using these same divisions, which I'll transfer across like so. Again, in the next video, we'll be looking at these forms which make up the mannequin more in depth, and over the course of this series, you will become more familiar with it, so don't worry if this is a lot to take in at the start. It might be useful to have an image like this at hand for you to refer to in case you need to remind yourself of the proportions now and then. Anyways, I'm going to conclude this first introductory video here. This is the box mannequin that we'll be looking at more in depth as we progress through this series. So I hope you look forward to it. If you found this helpful and want to see more, then please leave a like on the video. With that being said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. If you enjoyed the content I create, then do consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You will gain access to exclusive tutorials, study documents, process papers, real-time drawing footage and more. Plus, you will also be supporting me in a more personal way. Other than that, thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you soon.